Thank you, Neil. I'll talk more about my books in a moment. And thank you, Freedom for Faith, for having me. Thank you, Mike, and the board. I am also a board member of Freedom for Faith, but I can't unilaterally declare myself a speaker. So I appreciate the accommodation, and thank you all for coming. Mike has given me this fancy iPad, which apparently is supposed to use to move the slides myself. So good that appears to be working, which is good. I am Dr. Alex Deagon. I'm an Associate Professor of Law at QUT. My main research area is in religious freedom, which is obviously relevant to Freedom for Faith and what we're looking at today. I also teach in philosophy of law and constitutional law. So, Max, I quite enjoyed your presentation and the myriad of references to various philosophers who I've read and some who I haven't. Okay. So, book. I have just published a book earlier this year. So please forgive me for a moment of shameless plugging. The book is called A Principled Framework for the Autonomy of Religious Communities, Reconciling Freedom and Discrimination. And my presentation today is drawn from parts of that book. So if you like it and you want more, the book is available on a desk out the back there. There's a few hard copies which you can buy straight away today for the greatly discounted price of $100, and that is like a 50% discount, by the way. The commercial publishers love their highly priced academic books. If you're not quite ready for that kind of commitment, there are also some order forms there which you can take and then order independently from the publisher, also at a significant, I think, 35% discount. So in my book is basically a theological analysis of different legal systems, Australia, the US and the UK, and how they protect the freedom of religious communities. And by freedom of religious communities, I mean the freedom of churches, schools, hospitals, charities, other religious associations to govern their own affairs, essentially, and how that freedom is reconciled with equality in these different jurisdictions. So if you're interested in having a look at the book, as I said, there's a table at the back and there's an FPOS machine or cash. Talk to Alanda, who is the operations manager for Freedom for Faith and is wandering around somewhere. I don't know where she is at the moment, but she'll be out the back there. Okay, good. So just in terms of what I'll be going through in this presentation, I'll just be talking briefly about kind of the background and theory behind the book. I won't go into that too much because that could take up the whole presentation, but then I'm going to focus in on Australia particularly, which is, of course, what's most relevant for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about Australia's constitutional context, the relationship between religion and the Constitution, and then focus specifically on the religious exemptions and the Sex Discrimination Act, which basically allow religious educational institutions to select and preference employees for their organisations. And that has been kind of one of the most controversial laws which exist at the moment. I'm going to talk about religious freedom in schools and the various problems with the exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act from different perspectives. And then I'm going to discuss what I offer as my solution in the book, which is the idea of positive rights to associate around religious beliefs rather than exemptions. And I'll explain the difference between exemptions and positive rights a little later on. Some people say we should have a Bill of Rights, which protects religious freedom, and I'll explain why that may not be a good idea. and then I'll talk about the current Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry and what's next from here. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to be turning around to check whether the slides are actually working, so we'll stay on track, and my eyes aren't good enough to read the screen back there to tell. So, background and theory behind the book. So, Mike gave a really great overview of what religious freedom is, the ability to believe or change belief, but not just that, also to act and to practice and to gather and to create associations through which those beliefs can be articulated and can be practiced. And religious freedom is recognised by everyone as, a fundamental human right, an important social good. As is equality, of course. Equality, which is the idea of treating like cases and like people alike, and not kind of unjustly treating someone differently or in an inferior way. This is also an important foundational social good and a fundamental human right. So kind of everyone agrees on that. But where the problems arise is that these rights, religious freedom and equality, sometimes conflict. There's sometimes tensions between them. And I think we've seen this most obviously lately through the religious freedom and schools issue. Should schools be allowed to discriminate against employees, choose not to employ certain people or remove from employment certain people who do not adhere to the beliefs and the conduct expected by the school? Some view these conflicts as kind of necessary and intractable, like they just exist, there's no solutions, it's a zero-sum game, someone has to win. And if someone wins, someone else loses. But what I have found in my kind of reading and writing around this for many years now is that many people from a kind of across the political spectrum, both conservative and progressive, both kind of advocating for equality or advocating for religious freedom, there are people from across the spectrum who are calling for compromise, who are calling for understanding, calling for generosity. The problem with this is that everyone calls for compromise and then say, well, this is how we compromise. My view wins, which is, of course, not really compromise, and it's kind of about what kind of tone do we take. So it's actually, sometimes it doesn't amount to much more than just sentiment. Let's be nice to each other and try to figure out a solution, but there's no sort of systematic or principled way to really do that. So that's what I try to provide in my book. I try to provide a substantive, a principled way for reconciling religious freedom and equality, for seeing them both as important social goods which should be supported and upheld together. And in developing this framework, I draw on Christian theology and in particular the idea of the Christian virtues, such as love, which Max very ably kind of articulated, but also the other Christian virtues that we see in the Bible, like humility and patience and forgiveness and so forth. And these enable us to create a peaceful coexistence, or a situation where we can exist peacefully together despite our differences, or even with our differences contributing to a stronger, a more cohesive society. So using this framework, I critique the different legal and theoretical frameworks in the different countries, essentially, for reconciling religious freedom and equality, and I provide some kind of practical suggestions and policy suggestions for how these different jurisdictions can be improved in that respect. So, I mean, that's basically what I do in the book, and then I'm going to focus in more on Australia. And it's working. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about religion and the Australian Constitution. The Constitution has been in the news a lot lately with the Voice referendum. And I'm not going to comment on the referendum except to say it's always interesting to me how much the general public don't know about the Constitution. Like I teach it, I research it, I'm immersed in it. I think I have a certain amount of ignorance regarding how much everyone else knows. But people don't know about the Constitution, they don't know about what it says, they don't know about the background behind it. And so I'm hoping that this background on religion and the Constitution will be helpful for people. So essentially religion is mentioned in our Constitution in two places. The first is in the preamble, which says in part, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth. And before anyone asks where the other states are, they either weren't around at that time or they didn't want to be involved at that time. Western Australia, is, for example, is always a bit late to the party when it comes to constitutional things. And the territories also didn't really exist yet. So just those states, which at the time were the colonies, agreed, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, to create a federal commonwealth. And then Section 116 of the Constitution, which is called the Freedom of Religion provision, says the following: "The Commonwealth shall not make any law for establishing any religion, or for imposing any religious observance, or for prohibiting the free exercise of any religion, and no religious test shall be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under the Commonwealth." I'm not going to go into detail about what that means, but it's there for you, so you're aware of it. I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the background and broader implications of that provision. So it may surprise some of you to know that the churches and theological considerations were actually central to the creation of the Constitution. They were central to federation. Australia at the time was 96% Christian. It's my view that the Constitution wouldn't have been successful. Federation wouldn't have been successful without the support of the churches. The churches galvanised the people more broadly, and one of the ways that they did that was by saying we should have something in the Constitution about relying on God, or something acknowledging God in the Constitution, because this is how we will bring blessing upon our nation. This is how we will flourish. There were some kind of dissenting views, even among the different Christian denominations. The Seventh-day Adventists, for example, were not keen on having religion involved with politics at all, for very noble, theologically grounded reasons. But they said basically, if you have religion and politics mixing together, it messes up both of them. And so they didn't think that should happen. But they were at that time in the minority. The mainstream denominations all took the view that we should have religion kind of explicitly acknowledged and implemented, or at least supported, facilitated in society. And so after some jousting about what the precise words should be, the framers of the Constitution, the writers, came up with humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God. And the idea behind this was that Australia should be a religious society, it should support religion, it should encourage the flourishing and the facilitation of religion. So that was kind of one angle. The other angle, which was just as important, was that they didn't want to be like England. They didn't want to have an established church. They didn't want to have a state religion. They didn't want religion imposed on anyone. And that was one of the concerns of the Adventists as well. And so through the advocacy of the Adventists and many other denominations. Section 116 was created, which was designed to prevent the creation of a state church and to promote freedom of religion. So then Section 116 is what I call a pluralist provision, which facilitates beneficial interactions between religion and government, but doesn't impose religion. So there are some who say that Section 116 is a separation between church and state, like it's kind of a strict separation like in the US, but that's not correct. Section 116 isn't a strict separation between church and state. It was never intended to be that way, and it doesn't operate that way. It's designed to limit, in some ways, the way in which religion can be implemented by the state, but it's also designed to be a way in which religion and government can work together and flourish. And we see that in the way that our society operates. You know, our governments can financially support religions through, for example, tax exemptions, through support of denominational schools. That's allowed and under our constitution. You know, religion can influence government. Religious arguments can be brought to the table, or arguments grounded in religious views to come to particular policy positions. Religious ministers, clergy, other ministry workers can be members of Parliament. So there's no strict separation between church and state under our constitution. Section 116 is designed to balance the desire for Australia to support religion with the desire to make sure that religion isn't imposed on anyone. Okay, so let's move on to particular laws, and I'm just going to focus, as I said in this presentation, on one set of particularly contentious laws which are contained in Section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act. This provision contains long-standing exemptions which allow religious educational institutions, according to the text, to discriminate on the basis of protected attributes such as sexual orientation or gender identity in connection with employment. The scope of the discrimination is limited. It must occur in accordance with the doctrines of the religion in good faith to avoid injuring the religious susceptibilities of adherents. What this means, in effect, is that religious schools can select and regulate staff in accordance with religious teachings to uphold the ethos of that particular school or institution. These exemptions became particularly controversial after the Ruddock Review. So you may remember the same-sex marriage debate. There were concerns about religious freedom expressed during that debate. In an attempt to address these concerns, then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull agreed to set up what was essentially an inquiry into the status of the human right to freedom of religion. That inquiry was chaired by former Howard Government Minister Philip Ruddock and then became known as the Ruddock Review. So, I mean, in essence, the Ruddock Review found that there's no systematic problem with freedom of religion in Australia, but there are isolated kind of aspects where freedom of religion is challenged. There are tensions which need to be addressed. There's a lack of protection in some areas, and there's also an increasing social hostility and ignorance of religion which should be addressed. One of the other aspects or recommendations from the review, which was unfortunately prematurely leaked, was the maintenance of the exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act. The funny thing is that the recommendations from the Ruddock Review were actually to narrow the exemptions by including a requirement of transparency on the part of the schools. But the fact that these exemptions existed at all caused an outcry because many people were apparently unaware that they have actually existed for decades. Indeed, they've existed since the creation of the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975. And these exemptions were actually reaffirmed and extended by the Labor government in 2013. The Labor government passed an Amendment Act which included sexual orientation and gender identity as protected attributes, but in passing that act, they also extended the exemptions to cover those protected attributes. So they were acknowledged and extended by the Labor government at the time. But since kind of the public has been made aware of these exemptions, there's been a concerted campaign to water down or remove them. So why is this? Well, there's two different angles to approach the problems with the exemptions. One set of problems comes from those who emphasise the importance of equality over religious freedom. According to this view, all exemptions to anti-discrimination law enshrine unjust discrimination and should be removed. The Sex Discrimination Act exemptions in particular are vague and broad, which essentially gives religion a licence to unjustly or even maliciously discriminate. They're an affront to, in particular, members of the LGBT community and prevent them from living their lives openly and authentically through, for example, seeking employment at a religious school while also wanting to, say, marry their same-sex partner. They therefore impose material harm on those who are discriminated against because they may have their employment rejected, they may have their contracts terminated, and they also may be rejected by their religious communities. But another set of problems comes from those who emphasise the importance of religious freedom. The problem is the exemptions as they currently exist kind of give the impression of a special privilege to engage in what is otherwise unlawful discrimination. So if you have an anti-discrimination law and you have a little carve-out for, say, religious schools, it looks a bit sus. Like, why can religious schools discriminate in this way when other organisations and people can't? Having religious freedom as an exemption also intuitively subordinates religious freedom to equality. So religious freedom looks like just a little subcategory of equality where this kind of special conduct is allowed, rather than seeing religious freedom as a separate and independent social good which should be pursued and protected. Most importantly, the exemptions don't actually give religious schools what they need. What religious schools need are positive rights for people of faith to set up educational communities and run them in accordance with their religious beliefs, including the ability to make decisions regarding the beliefs and conduct of staff. Decisions where staff are required to uphold certain beliefs and behaviours in order to be employed at the school. So what I propose as a solution is the idea of positive associational rights. This sees the limits around discrimination law as an integral part of a structure designed to protect both religious freedom and equality. So anti-discrimination laws exist, they're important to protect equality, but there are also positive rights for religious freedom to enable religious associations to create institutions to practice their beliefs, either through providing education, but also charity or hospitals or anything else. Positive rights to associate include rights for schools to create an educational community where every member of that community, especially the staff, are models which uphold how that community should be. And this requires belief and conduct standards which should be implemented. And this kind of makes sense to me, at least, because if you think about what an association is, it's a group that gathers for a particular purpose. And if someone doesn't agree with that purpose, then they don't have to associate with you. They can go and create their own association or join a different association that adheres more to what they believe and what they want to achieve. The ability to associate necessarily requires the ability to exclude, because otherwise the association isn't distinct in any way. The entire purpose for creating it is undermined. It's just not reasonable for someone who disagrees with what the association does to come in and try to change it. And I think this principle is or should be applied to religious schools just as much as it is applied to, for example, political parties. You know, it'd be absurd for us to say, well, the Greens should be allowed to hire anyone they want, even if they want to create new coal power stations, or if they want to undermine certain environmental concerns. No, we'd say, well, the Greens are entitled to say, no, we don't want you because you wouldn't adhere to our ethos. And it's the same with schools or any other kind of religious association. This is pluralism in practice. It's the support of free, diverse communities without state endorsement or prohibition of any particular community. It implements, I think, also the church-state pluralism envisaged by Section 116 of the Constitution, where the state isn't endorsing or imposing or prohibiting any religion, but it does facilitate the ability of religions to exist how they want to exist. And what I've argued in other work is that if the Sex Discrimination Act exemptions are removed, I think this would actually breach the free exercise clause of Section 116. And therefore any such legislation would be invalid. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into the details of that, but if people want to, I can later. Okay. So some people have proposed that we should enshrine positive associational rights for religious freedom through a Bill of Rights. This is the best mechanism, they argue, for protecting religious freedom and balancing it with other rights, such as equality. But our current Australian experience shows us that, at least so far, that just doesn't work. So there are some human rights charters or bills of rights, they go by different names, which currently exist in different Australian states, including, for example, Queensland and Victoria. The problem is they provide protection for religious freedom, which is limited and selective. These human rights charters don't adhere to the strict requirements of international law, and particularly Article 18 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. So there are a number of ways in which the protection is limited and selective, but there are two which are really critical. The first is these human rights charters say that any limits placed around rights, such as religious freedom, can be reasonable, whereas the international law says that any restriction on rights, such as religious freedom, must be necessary. So for the lawyers in the room, reasonableness is a lower standard, a lower threshold than necessity. So what the international law says is that any government needs to demonstrate that it is necessary for religious freedom rights to be limited, and they have to explain why, and they have to justify it. But what the state human rights charters say is that it only needs to be reasonable. So in other words, the government just needs to give a reason, a genuine reason, but just a reason for why the right needs to be limited, but they don't need to demonstrate that it's necessary. So that's a lower standard, and thus under the state human rights charters, it's easier for religious freedom rights to be limited, and it doesn't adhere to international law. Article 18 of the ICCPR also says that states are obliged to respect the rights of parents to educate their children in accordance with their convictions. And a big part of that is the creation of faith schools. There's nothing remotely similar to that in our state human rights charters. That right just isn't really acknowledged. So that's another significant shortcoming or omission. This failure of state human rights charters means that there's a lack of confidence that a Commonwealth bill or a Commonwealth human rights charter will fare any better than the state ones. And the ideological dominance of equality norms means that view that this is a zero-sum game, religious freedom and equality is in conflict, one of them has to win, it may mean that religious freedom concerns are often trumped by equality concerns. And I think that's what's happened in these state human rights charters. Equality is seen as more important than religious freedom, and so the standards of protection for religious freedom are lower than they should be. Okay, which brings us to today. So as I think most of you will be aware, the Australian Law Reform Commission is due to deliver its findings in an inquiry into religious freedom and discrimination in schools by the end of the year, could be any time. And this may result in Parliament introducing legislation next year. The ALRC makes a recommendation, that goes to the government then decides what to do with it. But given that the Albanese government has committed to introducing something like a religious discrimination bill, I think it's likely that we'll see something next year. The ALRC released a discussion paper talking a bit about what they wanted to do about religious freedom and discrimination in schools earlier this year. And as anyone who is across these issues would know, that discussion paper was ominous. There were a lot of problematic aspects to that paper, and the effect of the recommendations or the ideas in that paper would be that the religious freedom of schools would be significantly curtailed. So as a result of that, academics in the field who are supportive and other advocates, including Freedom for Faith, have been working hard to persuade the ALRC that changes are needed and that discussion paper is just not going to be suitable. And so we're hopeful that the forthcoming ALRC recommendations will be more friendly. So what can you do and what can we do? I think it's important that we keep ourselves and our various faith communities engaged with these issues. Sign up and subscribe to Freedom for Faith. Donate if you feel led, because we do a lot of work behind the scenes. Putting on my board member hat for a moment. We do a lot of work behind the scenes, advocacy, submissions to inquiries and things to try to preserve our freedoms. And we can keep you appraised of what's happening. Make submissions to the ALRC inquiry if they ask for more submissions, or to the various parliamentary inquiries that will happen if legislation is introduced, and encourage your communities to do this as well. There are big nerds like me and Neil and other members of the board who do long, complicated submissions, but you don't have to do that. If you're not an expert in this area, if you're just a concerned citizen, even a one-page submission will be effective and will be listened to. You're a parent of a child in a religious school. You are a member of some kind of religious association and community. You have concerns, express them, voice them. Even just thinking pragmatically, politicians are all about numbers. They'll be concerned when just everyday community members express consternation about proposed changes. And the more submissions that come in, the more they will be concerned and the more they will listen. So I encourage you to do that as well. Thank you for listening. Are we doing questions now, Mike, or are we not?
We've got... So on questions, Alex is going to be joining us in the plenary at the end of the session. The main reason some of our speakers will be taking questions at the time, some won't, but let me quickly see what you guys have been beavering away on Slido. In the meantime, while my phone is loading, we're going to be breaking for morning tea. There is lots of food right up the back. The tea and coffee you've probably already discovered. To my left, to your right, over that side is the special diets for those who asked, and bathrooms are to the far left. I'll take this one because this is hilarious. How realistic is it to expect recognition of positive rights of freedom of religion for associations in Australian legislation?
Well, how realistic are any political aspirations, really? I mean, what I think may happen is that I think there will be some kind of positive rights recognised if a religious discrimination bill is introduced. The old drafts of it did have that to an extent. And that got to the stage of being almost passed through Parliament, so that was very close. It ended up being ditched for various good reasons, but it was quite close. Given that people on all sides kind of the spectrum are advocating for something like a Bill of Rights, I think it's possible that may come up for consideration as well, and that will contain some kind of protection for religious freedom. The question, as I said, will be how strong is that protection? Does it adhere to international law? How does that balance with other rights, such as equality? I think it's possible we may see something. The question is going to be, of course, how good is it?
And we'll talk about the politics of that one later. I just did find another one question to hold everyone's food up. Would positive associational rights require a need to act for the social good? For example, looking after students with intellectual disability. And how would we find that balance?
Well, I think what would be expressed in positive associational rights wouldn't go into that amount of detail in the legislation. So it would just be something like, at a broad level, the ability for religious, say, educational institutions to select and preference staff in accordance with the beliefs of that organisation. I mean, students are another issue again, and there may be legislation about that as well. But I think it would be reasonable to say that that's probably going to be left up to the schools. And that would also be governed under different legislation. So there's disability discrimination. There's a Disability Discrimination Act as well that would be governed under, and it probably wouldn't come into the religious side of things.
Mm. And our schools generally do an excellent job of that. And I'm sure Peter will say something now. But thank you, Alex. Thank you for your time. Can we all thank Alex?